The good news is that's absolutely nothing to do with RMS. This is the rate of change in exports year on year. In this case, we can't blame Johnny Foreigner. Irish pharmaceutical exports have managed to offset the fall in exports in other areas, and Ireland is one of the only developed countries in the world to have non-oil exporting countries in the world to have a basically static or slightly increasing exports in the middle of the worst global recession in whatever 75, 80 years. And the good thing we didn't go for the Finnish model. They're obviously heavily dependent on Nokia ICT goods being hit heavily, along with cars and a few other areas. So Finland exports were down earlier this year by 40%. So we can't blame the global recession. We're in the middle of our own recession. So there's the international factors there, imports and exports, and these are the domestic factors, consumption and investment. And they're the ones that are, even regardless of your political ideology, they're the ones that are mathematically dragging GDP down. You can't argue with that. So if we're in the middle of a very own recession, that tells us something about the kind of recovery we can expect to have. So I did a bit of scenario building and said, what if the government had a choice and could say, next year we either want to be part of some global recovery where exports increase 10%, or we want some kind of domestic dream scenario where consumption goes up about 10%. And bear in mind that exports are, in volume terms, bigger than consumption. The problem is every export in Ireland pretty much has a corresponding import, based on the nature of our trading. So a global dream scenario, the small size the small number of people employed in exporters as well would mean that even a global dream scenario would about level off in our GDP next year, because of what's happening on the internal side. If we have a domestic dream, we get back to what the ESRI regards as some kind of natural growth rate for Ireland, is 3 to 4%. But that's only in a scenario where consumption grows next year by as much as it ever did in any 1 year period over the course of the boom. So it tells you something about the kind of recovery we should wish for, and all this talk of exports. I mean, obviously they're important. We have to pay our way, but beware when you pray for these things. Beware that when your answers are your prayers are answered, you might not know it because you're only levelled off. Sorry, I know I've dragged on a minute or two. I'll just finish up now. These are the four problems as I see them. I think the financial market, which obviously we're here to talk about today, and the exchequer, the government borrowing as opposed to government spending, the property market we've covered in depth, and the labour market, which I think gets ignored sometimes. Certainly in the order of urgency, the urgent important matrix, it probably slips out because it's important but not urgent. To close, three comments. Negative equity is a real problem. It's latent for some because they're not selling their homes, but it's real for others because they're being made unemployed. The yield, and this is where we get to, as I say, tee off on the NAMA side, the yield in the property market is going to be very important over the next few years and may determine how far house prices have to fall. And NAMA could be a dramatic example of this. So, negative equity and unemployment. Here are some calculations, again, based on the information we have about the joint incidence of negative equity and unemployment. So, there's on the far right is if house prices were to fall another 20% and its a live register were to hit 500,000, you'd be talking about anywhere up to 3% of households affected by both negative equity, where they don't have enough to pay off their mortgage, and unemployment, don't have to pay their mortgage on a month-to-month basis. Last two slides. This is the implication for Dublin house prices if rents were to go back to a 5.25% yield. 5.25% is not spectacular. It may be just above the cost of borrowing in the medium-term sense. This is going from 1998 on. So you see how far house prices rose, and this is how far house prices would have to fall again. They'd have to fall back to 2000 levels, and they'd have to fall back almost 60%. That sounds like a really nice mathematical exercise. The problem is NAM is going to be spending our taxpayers' money if it goes ahead on the basis of long-term economic value. So if this is the fall in rents, we've already seen a 20% fall in rents. If it goes all the way to 40% or 50%, based on what yield you want, here's how far house prices have to go. So there's certainly between 40 and 60%. That tells you something about the job NAMA has cut out for it. So sorry I went a little over time there, but hopefully I finished off at least on a relevant note. Thanks for your time.
Ronan, would you like to take some
just
quick questions? And people got some quick questions at this point. Judy?
I hope this isn't too early for these sorts of thoughts, but just these last few minutes you said that you felt that prices need to come down to 50% to sort out the yield issues. But how does that relate long term? I mean, I've understood that normally house prices should be about 12 to 14 times your annual rental. And the other point that certainly for as long as I can remember, before the last 15 years or so, house prices always used to be able to get a mortgage for at a maximum 4 times your income. Now, both of those figures end up that your average price of a house should be about 150,000. So that, you know, even if it falls 50%, it isn't enough. Even that isn't enough. And what we've been talking about is how to reach a balance, but that doesn't deal with other issues. And the other point is you're saying that the issue is consumption. And again, you were sort of really discussing where do we have to go to get back into some sort of equilibrium. But what we in the environmental movement know is that most of that consumption is imported from China using a very high carbon footprint. So in actual fact, we don't want to bring consumption back to 10% of what increases every year. We want to go in the opposite direction. So you've got two completely different pulls here. You've got one saying, well, what do we need for equilibrium so that we don't all freak out and all the rest of it, and we've got the other one for a long-term future.
Yeah, no, on the second point, and again, this is the economist's cop-out always, I wasn't necessarily saying that return, that domestic consumption boom is an unalloyed good thing. There's obviously elements there, but that was if the government had that choice and could pick between the two, what would be the implications of it? And obviously the government, the way it thinks maybe overly GDP, and I think GDP it's a terrible measure. It just happens to be the best we have at the moment. But people are trying to come up with far better ones, and I would certainly agree with trying to come up with a better one. So I totally agree with you on that point that a return to consumption may look like a good thing, but may not be one. On the first point, the rental yields. This is essentially that 4% to 6% is what you're talking about in terms of the relationship between house prices and rents. And the uncertainty about it at the moment is that rents are falling faster than they've ever fallen before. So as if rents go down like this much and house prices had needed to fall by that much, house prices may need to go down even further. And
what about incomes? The relationship between borrowing and income?
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I suppose we could get into a much longer discussion, and we might do so later about that. But the typical household now buying a sustainable home that they can live in for 10, 15 years is going to be, on balance, double income rather than single income, and that affects the maths, the 150 or 250,000. So there's a whole range of changes based on the traditional multiples that would have been used. But certainly, I'm happy to talk about that later as well.
It did used to be 4 for a double income, in fact, 4 times your income. It used to be 2.5 times your income for the main earner, 1.5 times your income for the second earner. So it was still only 4 times your income.
Yeah, but there was also the cap you had to raise yourself, don't forget. It wasn't just the mortgage equality to the price and so on. Okay. Anyway, what we take from that is all the signs are going down, difficult to predict, and it's our own problem for the moment, and we can't look for a rescue from outside. Thanks very much, and if you could stay around, because I'm sure people may want to ask other questions as other issues are raised. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.